The night Pearl Hart chose to ride into Redstone Canyon alone, the moon hung low and red as a brand fresh from the fire, and every soul in Larkspur Junction would later say she had ridden out to her death. She did not think of it that way. She thought only of the 6 miles between her and the man she had spent 3 years pretending to despise, and of the dynamite that would go off at first light whether she made it there or not. It was the spring of 1885, in the high desert country of the Arizona Territory, where the grass came up green and short after the winter rains and dried to gold by June, where the creeks ran silver with snowmelt from the Bradshaw Range, and every rancher along their banks measured his fortune by how much of that water he could claim before his neighbor did. Pearl's father, Nathaniel Hart, had staked the upper reaches of Willow Creek back in 1862, when the territory was still crawling with soldiers, and the Apache raids kept most white settlers close to the forts. He had not done it alone. Thomas Bristol, a broad-shouldered Missouri man with a laugh that carried across 2 hollows, had staked the lower reaches beside him, and for 11 years the 2 men had run their cattle together as though the fence line between the Hart spread and the Bristol spread did not exist at all. Then came the drought of 1873, and with it came the lawsuit, and by the time the circuit judge in Prescott had finished dividing the water rights, Nathaniel Hart held the senior claim to Willow Creek and Thomas Bristol held a bitterness that never did wash away. The 2 men did not speak again before Thomas Bristol died of a fever in the winter of 1880, and Nathaniel Hart followed him into the Larkspur Junction Cemetery 2 years after that, thrown from a Greenbrook gelding and dragged 40 yards before his foreman could catch the horse. So it was that the feud passed down like a family Bible, heavy with old words neither of the children had written, to Pearl Hart and to Thomas Bristol's only son, Edgar. Pearl was 24 years old that spring, and she had spent every one of the 2 years since her father's death proving to the men of Yavapai County that a woman could run 4,000 head of cattle without a husband standing behind her signature. She rode astride instead of side saddle, wore her chestnut hair in a single braid tucked beneath a flat-crowned hat, and carried a Winchester across her saddle bow as naturally as she carried her father's stubborn pride in her chest. The bank in Larkspur Junction had tried twice to convince her to sell the Hart spread to a syndicate out of Tucson, and twice she had walked out of the manager's office with her chin high and her answer sharp enough to draw blood. Edgar Bristol was 28, tall and sun-browned, with his father's easy laugh buried somewhere beneath 5 years of hard work and harder debt. He had come home from a cattle drive to Kansas to bury his father, and had stayed to fight a ranch that seemed determined to fail out from under him, one bad season following another, until the note he had signed with the Larkspur Junction Bank hung over his head like a hawk circling a rabbit. He did not hate Pearl Hart, not truly, though he had told himself for years that he did, because it was easier to be angry at the daughter of the man who had taken half his father's water than to admit that half a creek had never been enough to save the Bristol Ranch on its own. It was a dry goods errand that brought Pearl into town on that fateful afternoon, nothing more dramatic than a list of flour and coffee, and a spool of barbed wire her foreman needed for the south fence. She had tied her mare outside Whitfield's Mercantile and gone in through the front, and it was only by chance, only because the storeroom door behind the counter had been left ajar, that she heard the voice she would remember for the rest of her life. "The charge goes in at the Narrows above Redstone Canyon," the voice said, low and confident, a voice she did not recognize but would soon learn belonged to a man named Silas Crane. "4 sticks ought to do it, maybe 6 if the rock is stubborn. Blow the old Beaver Dam, and the whole spring runoff comes down the canyon and out across the Bristol bottomland before that fool boy even wakes up. His herd is bunched in the low pasture for branding, every head of it. By the time the water recedes he will not have enough cattle left to pay the dust off his boots, let alone the note he owes this bank." Pearl went still behind a barrel of pickled herring, her heart hammering so loud she was certain the men on the other side of the door could hear it. "And the note comes due when?" asked a second voice, older, wheezing slightly, a voice she did recognize now that she strained to place it. It belonged to Cyrus Whitfield, the very man who owned the mercantile and sat on the bank's board of directors. 30 days, Crane answered. He cannot pay it without that herd, and he cannot borrow against land that is sitting under 4 feet of floodwater. The syndicate takes the ranch at auction for a fraction of what the water rights alone are worth, and nobody in this territory is any the wiser that I own every share of the company that buys it. And if someone finds out you set the charge yourself, nobody sets foot in that canyon, Crane said, and Pearl could hear the smile in it. Not at night, not for love or money. The trail is a goat path, and the walls come down if you sneeze wrong. By the time anybody rides the long way around, the flood will be finished and gone, and there will be nothing left to prove but bad luck and an act of God. Pearl did not remember leaving the mercantile. She remembered only that she was outside on the boardwalk with her basket of flour and coffee forgotten on the counter, and that the sun was already sliding down toward the western hills, and that somewhere in her chest a decision had already been made before her mind had finished catching up to it. She rode for the Hart ranch at a gallop that left her mare lathered white by the time she reached the yard, and she found her foreman, Jedediah Osler, mending a hinge on the barn door in the long light of evening. "Miss Pearl," he said, straightening at the sight of her face, "what in the name of Sam Hill has got into you? Jed, how long would it take a rider to go around by the main road to the Bristol place?" The old man scratched at his gray beard, considering. 20 miles if it is afoot, maybe 22 the way that road switches back on itself past Cottonwood Wash. 4 hours hard riding, more if the moon goes behind cloud. And across the canyon. Jedediah's face changed then, the way a man's face changes when he hears a question he wishes had not been asked. "You are not thinking what I believe you are thinking." "How long, Jed?" 6 miles, maybe less as the crow flies, but you are no crow, Miss Pearl, and neither is that mare. That trail through Redstone Canyon has not been rode by daylight in a decade, let alone by dark. Your own father lost 2 good horses on that shale before he swore off it for good. There is a reason nobody in this county crosses that canyon. There is dynamite set to blow the old dam above the Narrows before sunup, Pearl said, and watched the color drain out of Jedediah Osler's weathered face. It will flood the Bristol bottomland and drown every head of cattle Edgar Bristol has gathered for branding. If I do not warn him before that charge goes off, he loses his ranch to a man named Silas Crane who already owns the bank's paper on it. Then we send a rider by the road, and we send him now. There is no time, Jed. You said so yourself. 4 hours by the road and the moon is already up. I can be there in under 2 if I go through the canyon. You will be dead in under 2 if you go through that canyon, dark as it is. Pearl looked past him, toward the hills already purpling with the coming night, toward the direction where 6 miles of broken rock and switchback trail separated her ranch from the man whose father had quarreled with her own for 11 bitter years. She thought of Edgar Bristol as she had last seen him, 3 months past, at the county fair in Larkspur Junction, standing tall beside his prize bull with a look on his face that was equal parts pride and exhaustion, a man fighting a war on a battlefield that was slowly swallowing him whole. She had not spoken to him that day. She had told herself she had no cause to. "He is going to lose everything, Jed, and he will never even know why until it is too late to stop it," she said. "I will not stand by and let a man's whole life wash down a canyon because his father and mine could not share a creek 30 years ago. That is not who I am, and it is not who my father raised me to be, whatever bad blood passed between him and old Thomas Bristol." Jedediah Osler looked at her for a long moment, and something in his weathered face softened, the way it had softened when she was a girl of 6 insisting she could rope a calf same as any hired hand. "Take the buckskin, not the mare," he said finally. "He is surer footed on shale than any horse on this place, and he has been over rough country before. And take my lantern, though I doubt it will do you much good on that trail where the walls close in tight enough to touch both sides at once. And Pearl," He caught her arm as she turned toward the corral. "If that trail looks like it means to kill you, you turn that horse around and you let the Bristol Ranch take its chances. You hear me? No warning is worth your life." "I hear you, Jed," she said, and did not promise anything at all. The buckskin gelding, a sturdy animal named Dusty that had carried her father over half the rough country in Yavapai County before he had ever thought to buy the Greenbroke horse that killed him, seemed to sense the urgency in the way she cinched his saddle, and stood steady while she checked the girth twice and slid her father's old Winchester into its scabbard. She left the mercantile basket forgotten on Whitfield's counter and rode out of the Hart Ranch yard as the last light went purple and then indigo over the Bradshaw Peaks. And she did not look back at the lit windows of the house where she had grown up, because looking back was not a thing Pearl Hart allowed herself to do. The mouth of Redstone Canyon opened up out of the sagebrush flats like a wound in the earth, a narrow gash of red sandstone and gray shale that ran arrow straight for nearly 6 miles before it opened out again into the broad valley, where the Bristol Ranch made its home. By daylight it was a fearsome enough sight, walls rising 300 feet on either side, so close in places that a rider could reach out and touch both at once. The trail along its floor no wider than a deer path in some stretches, and littered everywhere with the loose broken shale that gave the place its name for the way it seemed to bleed rust-colored dust with every footfall. By the light of a rising moon, with shadows pooling black as spilled ink in every crevice and hollow, it was something closer to the mouth of hell itself, and Pearl felt her stomach twist as Dusty picked his way down the first steep grade into the canyon's throat. "Easy now," she murmured, more to steady her own nerve than the horse's, for Dusty seemed sure enough of himself, ears pricked forward, hooves finding purchase on the loose stone with the careful deliberation of an animal that had crossed hard country before and did not intend to be caught out by it now. The moon threw long fingers of pale light down between the canyon walls, enough to see the trail by in patches, though in others the darkness swallowed everything, and Pearl had to trust the horse beneath her more than her own eyes. She thought of her father as she rode, of the 2 horses he had lost on this very shale, of the way he used to say that Redstone Canyon was God's own reminder that some doors were meant to stay closed. She thought of Thomas Bristol, too, a man she remembered mostly as a booming laugh at the edge of childhood memory, a man who had once given her a peppermint stick from his coat pocket at a 4th of July picnic years, before the lawsuit turned him into a stranger who would not look at her father across a church aisle. She wondered, riding through the belly of that ancient stone wound with her heart in her throat, whether either of those 2 proud dead men would have wanted this, would have wanted their children still paying for a quarrel over water that neither of them had lived long enough to make peace with. The trail narrowed further as she went, and twice Dusty stopped dead and refused to go on until she dismounted and led him past a slide of loose rock that had swallowed the path entirely, picking her way on foot with the lantern held high and her breath coming shallow with fear she refused to name. Somewhere far above, an owl called out into the darkness, and somewhere closer, she heard the skitter of small stones falling from a ledge, and each time her whole body went rigid with the certainty that the canyon walls themselves were about to come down around her, burying her beneath the very disaster she was riding to prevent. It was perhaps 2 miles in, where the canyon bent sharply to the east around a great shoulder of red rock, that the ground gave way beneath Dusty's hind legs. Pearl felt it before she understood it, a lurch and a scramble and the horrible sensation of the world tilting sideways, and then she was falling, still half in the saddle, as Dusty's back legs slid out from under him on a patch of shale that had looked solid in the moonlight and proved instead to be nothing more than a thin crust over loose scree. She threw herself clear of the stirrups on instinct alone, tumbling hard onto the canyon floor as the horse scrambled and thrashed, and somehow, by some grace she would thank God for every day of her life afterward, found his footing again on more solid ground a few feet further down the slope. She lay still for a moment, the wind knocked clean out of her, staring up at a narrow ribbon of stars caught between the black canyon walls. And she thought, with a strange clarity that surprised her, not of her own possible death, but of Edgar Bristol asleep in his bed, with no notion at all that a flood was coming for him with the dawn. "Get up, Pearl," she told herself aloud, the sound of her own voice steadying her more than she expected. "Get up. You are not dying in this canyon tonight." She got up. Her left knee throbbed where she had struck it against stone, and there was a scrape along her forearm that stung fiercely, but nothing was broken, and Dusty stood trembling but sound a few yards off, reins trailing in the dust. She caught him, murmured soft nonsense words against his neck until his trembling eased, and checked him over by lantern light for injury, finding only a scrape along one foreleg that did not seem to trouble his gait. "We are both a sight tougher than that canyon gives us credit for," she told him, and swung back up into the saddle, ignoring the way her knee screamed in protest, and pressed on into the dark. The remaining miles passed in a blur of aching muscles and gritted teeth, the moon climbing higher and throwing the shadows into different shapes, the walls of the canyon slowly, so slowly, beginning to lower and widen as she came toward its eastern mouth. She heard water before she saw it, the distant murmur of Willow Creek running high with spring melt somewhere ahead, and she felt something in her chest ease at the sound, for it meant she was close now, close to the valley floor and the Bristol Ranch beyond it. She came out of the canyon's mouth a little after midnight, into a wide moonlit valley she had not set foot in since she was a child, and there below her, nestled against a stand of cottonwoods along the creek, sat the lights of the Bristol Ranch house, one lamp still burning gold in a downstairs window. Edgar Bristol was not asleep, though he probably ought to have been, given the branding that was set to begin at first light. He sat instead at the kitchen table with a ledger book open before him and a cup of coffee gone cold at his elbow, doing the same arithmetic he had done every night for a month, trying to make 30 days and a herd of cattle add up to enough money to satisfy a banknote that seemed to grow larger every time he looked at it. His sister Clara had gone up to bed an hour past, tired of watching him chase the same numbers around the same page, and the ranch hands were bedded down in the bunkhouse, resting up for a long day of dust and rope burn and bawling calves. It was the sound of a horse coming into the yard at a hard gallop that brought him up out of his chair with his hand going instinctively for the rifle propped by the door, for no rider came calling at that hour with good news. He stepped out onto the porch in his shirt sleeves, rifle held loose but ready, and found himself staring at a sight that made no sense to him at all. Pearl Hart, dust-covered and wild-eyed, swinging down off a lathered buckskin gelding in his own ranch yard in the dead of night. "Miss Hart," he said, and heard the disbelief in his own voice. "What in God's name are you doing on Bristol land at this hour?" "There is a dam above the Narrows in Redstone Canyon," Pearl said, and her voice came out ragged with exhaustion and urgency both. "Sela's crane means to blow it before sunup. The flood will come straight down the canyon and out across your bottomland, Mr. Bristol, right where your herd is bunched for branding. You have to move your cattle now tonight before that charge goes off." Edgar stared at her for a long moment, the rifle still in his hands, his mind working through what she had said and finding it almost too strange to credit. "You rode through Redstone Canyon," he said slowly, "at night, alone, to tell me this. I did not have time to go around by the road. Nobody rides that canyon by dark. Nobody rides it hardly at all. I am aware of that, Mr. Bristol, seeing as I nearly broke my neck doing it," Pearl snapped, her patience worn thin by exhaustion and fear and the ache in her knee. "Now are you going to stand there gaping at me, or are you going to wake your hands and move your herd before it drowns?" Something in the sharpness of her voice, so unlike the cool disdain she had always shown him at county gatherings and church socials, cut through his disbelief, and he found himself believing her before he had even decided to. "Why would you do this?" he asked, quieter now. "For me. Your father and mine were not exactly what a man would call friendly, and you have never had cause to think kindly of the Bristol name." Pearl met his eyes across the moonlit yard, and something passed between them that neither of them had words for yet. "Because I would not wish this on any man," she said, "rival or not. And because I do not believe our father's quarrel is worth a single one of your cattle, Mr. Bristol, let alone your whole ranch and everything you have worked for since he passed. Now please, there is not much time." Edgar Bristol was not a man who wasted daylight arguing with good sense once it was put plainly in front of him. He set down the rifle, and within 5 minutes he had rousted every hand in the bunkhouse, and within 10 the whole yard was alive with the sound of men swearing and saddling horses by lantern light. And Pearl found herself, despite the ache in every limb, swinging back up onto Dusty's back to help drive 400 head of bawling, sleep-confused cattle up out of the low bottomland pasture toward the higher ground of the North Mesa. It was hard, dirty, dangerous work in the dark, cattle spooking at shadows and hands cursing as they fought to keep the herd bunched and moving in the right direction. And more than once Pearl found herself riding hard along the flank of the herd to turn back a breakaway steer, her knees screaming with every jolt, her arms aching from the unfamiliar work of driving cattle rather than her own smaller herd's gentler routines. Edgar rode near her more often than not, and though there was little time for talk, she caught him glancing her way more than once with an expression she could not quite name, somewhere between gratitude and wonder. "You did not have to stay and help drive them," he called to her at one point, as they pushed a knot of stubborn heifers up the last steep grade toward the mesa top. "You delivered your warning. Nobody would have thought less of you for riding home. I did not ride through that canyon just to turn around and leave you to move 400 head alone," Pearl called back, swiping dust and sweat from her brow with the back of one gloved hand. "Besides, Mr. Bristol, I happen to be a fair hand with cattle, whatever you may have heard otherwise." He laughed then, a startled, genuine sound that carried across the noise of the herd, and it struck her that she had never once heard Edgar Bristol laugh in all the years she had known who he was, and that the sound of it, low and warm, did something strange and unwelcome to the steady rhythm of her heart. They finished moving the last of the herd up onto the safety of the mesa, just as the eastern sky began to pale from black to deep indigo, the stars fading one by one, and the ranch hands, exhausted but triumphant, began to make camp in a rough circle to keep watch over the settled cattle until full light. Edgar rode to where Pearl sat her horse at the mesa's edge, looking back down toward the valley and the dark mouth of Redstone Canyon beyond it, and reined in beside her. "I do not know how to thank you," he said quietly. "You saved every head of stock I own, and likely the whole ranch along with it, and you did it at a risk to your own life that I can hardly credit even now, having watched you do it." "You do not need to thank me," Pearl said, though something in her chest warmed at the words all the same. "Any decent person would have done the same. Not every decent person would have ridden Redstone Canyon alone by night to do it," Edgar said. "I mean it, Miss Hart. Pearl, if I may call you that after tonight. I owe you a debt I do not know how I could ever repay." Before she could answer, the ground trembled. It was not much at first, a low rumble that might have been distant thunder, except the sky above was clear and star-strewn as the dawn came on. Then it grew, a deep grinding roar that seemed to come from the earth itself, and both of them turned as one to look back toward the canyon mouth, just as a wall of white water came surging out of it with terrible speed, tearing down through the very bottomland pasture where 400 head of Bristol cattle had stood bunched together not 2 hours before. The flood hit the empty pasture with a sound like the end of the world, tearing loose fence posts and uprooting the cottonwoods along the creek bank, spreading out wide and brown and furious across the valley floor in the gray light of first dawn. Pearl felt Edgar's hand find hers where it rested on the saddle horn, gripping tight, and she did not pull away. "That water would have taken every animal I own," he said, his voice hoarse with the shock of seeing it, and likely the house along with it, given how high it is running. Pearl, if you had not come, if you had turned back at that canyon like any sensible person would have. I did not turn back, she said simply, because I could not make myself believe that letting you lose everything was any kind of sensible choice at all. They sat together at the mesa's edge and watched the flood spend its fury across the empty bottomland, watched the brown water finally begin to recede as the surge passed on down the valley toward the distant confluence with the Hasyampa, and neither of them said very much more, because there did not seem to be words large enough yet for what had passed between them in that single terrible, wonderful night. The sun came up fully over the eastern ridges to reveal a scene of considerable wreckage below, fence lines torn away, the low pasture scoured down to raw earth and scattered driftwood. The old bunkhouse that had stood nearest the creek collapsed entirely where the flood had undermined its foundation. But the herd stood safe and mostly calm on the high mesa, and the main ranch house, set back further from the creek on its own small rise, had escaped with nothing worse than a flooded root cellar. And Edgar Bristol, looking down at all of it, felt something in his chest that was almost too large to hold, a mixture of relief and grief for what was lost, and gratitude so fierce, it nearly brought him to tears in front of the woman who had ridden through hell itself to bring it to him. "I have to go into Larkspur Junction," he said finally, once the sun was well up and his hands had begun the grim work of assessing the damage. "Silas Crane needs to answer for this before the sheriff, and he needs to answer for it today before he has time to cover his tracks." "I heard him say it himself," Pearl said. "Him and Cyrus Whitfield both, plotting it out plain as day in the mercantile storeroom. I will swear to it before any judge in the territory." "You already did more than any judge could ask of you," Edgar said. "But I would be glad of your company riding in, if you are not too worn out from the night you have had." Pearl looked down at herself, at the torn sleeve and the dust ground into every fold of her clothing, at her hands still trembling faintly with exhaustion, and found that despite all of it, she did not want to be anywhere but beside Edgar Bristol as he rode to see justice done. "I would not miss it," she said. They rode the long way around by the main road this time, Edgar insisting she could not be asked to face Redstone Canyon twice in a single day, even if Dusty had come through the crossing sound. And the 20 miles passed with conversation that neither of them seemed able to stop once it started. Two people who had spent years believing they had nothing to say to each other, discovering instead that they had years of unspoken things to make up for. He asked her about running the Hart Ranch alone, and she found herself telling him honestly about the loneliness of it, the way the bank manager still addressed his letters to the owner of the Hart property, as though unable to bring himself to write a woman's name, the way she sometimes rode out to the highest point on her land, just to remember what it felt like to not be the only person for miles who understood the weight she carried. He told her in turn about his father's slow decline after the lawsuit, about the bitterness Thomas Bristol had carried to his grave, about how Edgar himself had spent 5 years since inheriting the ranch fighting a debt that felt sometimes like it might swallow him whole, and how strange and humbling it was to have that debt very nearly wiped clean by the very daughter of the man his father had never forgiven. "I do not believe my father ever meant to cheat yours," Pearl said carefully, as they rode past the turnoff toward Cottonwood Wash. "I found letters after he died, Mr. Bristol, letters he never sent, where he wrote out apologies to your father a dozen different ways and tore up every one of them because his pride would not let him send them. I do not think either of them ever stopped grieving what that lawsuit cost them, the friendship most of all. Call me Edgar," he said. "After last night, I think we are well past Mr. and Miss between us." "Edgar, then," she said, and found she liked the sound of his name in her mouth more than she was quite prepared for. They reached Larkspur Junction by mid-morning to find the town already buzzing with news of the flood, word having traveled fast on the lips of a ranch hand, sent ahead to fetch the doctor for a hand, who had wrenched his shoulder in the night's work. Edgar went straight to the sheriff's office, a low adobe building at the end of the main street with a hand-lettered sign hanging crooked above its door, and found Sheriff Amos Tolley, a heavy-set man with a gray mustache and tired eyes, already looking up from his desk with an expression of weary expectation, as though he had known trouble was coming his way before it ever walked through his door. "Sheriff," Edgar said, "I need to report an act of deliberate destruction against my property, and I have a witness who overheard the whole scheme planned out before it happened." Sheriff Tolley listened to the account with growing gravity, his pen scratching notes across a ledger sheet as Pearl recounted, word for word as best she could remember, the conversation she had overheard through the storeroom door. And by the time she finished, the sheriff's jaw had set in a hard line that boded ill for Silas Crane. "Blasting a dam without a permit is a crime against the territory regardless of who owns the water," Tolley said. "Doing it with the deliberate intent to destroy a neighbor's livelihood, and to defraud a bank customer through a straw purchase besides, that is a matter for the circuit judge, and likely for the territorial prosecutor too. I have had my suspicions about Silas Crane and his mining syndicate for some months now, Mr. Bristol, buying up water rights and grazing leases all up and down this county through shell companies that all seem to trace back to the same set of investors, but I have never had a witness willing and able to swear to his methods before now." "I am willing," Pearl said, "and I am able. I heard it with my own ears, Sheriff, plain as I am standing here now." "Then let us go pay Mr. Crane a visit," Tolley said, rising from his desk and reaching for his hat, "before he hears the dam has done its work and starts making plans of his own." They found Silas Crane at the Larkspur Junction Hotel, taking a late breakfast on the dining porch with the satisfied air of a man expecting good news to arrive at any moment. He was younger than Pearl had expected from his voice, perhaps 35, dressed in a fine gray suit far too formal for cattle country, with slick dark hair and a mustache waxed to careful points, and the smile he offered Sheriff Tolley faltered only slightly at the sight of Edgar Bristol and Pearl Hart standing behind the lawman with faces like thunder. "Sheriff Tolley," Crane said, rising smoothly from his chair, "what can I do for you this fine morning?" "You can start by telling me about the dynamite you had set above Redstone Canyon last night," Tolley said, "and about the flood it sent down onto Mr. Bristol's land, and about the shell company you own that stood to buy his ranch cheap at auction once his herd was drowned and his note came due." Crane's smile did not waver, though something went cold and careful behind his eyes. "I am afraid I do not know what you are talking about, Sheriff. I have been in this hotel since supper last night, as any number of the staff could tell you." "You may have been in this hotel," Pearl said, stepping forward, "but I heard you giving your instructions to Cyrus Whitfield through the storeroom door of his mercantile yesterday afternoon, plain as I am speaking now. 4 sticks of dynamite, you said, maybe 6 if the rock proved stubborn. You said nobody would ever cross Redstone Canyon to warn him in time, and that the flood would look like nothing more than an act of God." Crane's gaze flicked to her, taking in the dust still ground into her clothing, the scrape along her forearm, and something in his composure finally cracked, a flash of pure fury that he smoothed over almost as quickly as it appeared. "That is a serious accusation, Miss Hart," Pearl said. "Pearl Hart. And I will swear to every word of it before any judge you care to name, Mr. Crane, because I rode through that canyon myself in the dark of night to warn Mr. Bristol before your dynamite ever went off, and I watched the flood come down empty pasture this morning instead of drowning 400 head of his cattle the way you intended." For a long moment, Silas Crane said nothing at all, and the silence on that hotel porch stretched thin and brittle as old glass. Then he sat back down slowly in his chair, and something like resignation settled over his sharp features. "I want it noted," he said finally, "that I never intended harm to come to any person, only to the ranch. You will have ample opportunity to explain your intentions to the circuit judge when he comes through next month," Sheriff Tolley said grimly, pulling a set of iron manacles from his coat pocket. "In the meantime, Mr. Crane, you are under arrest for the deliberate destruction of property and for fraud against the Larkspur Junction Bank, whose depositors, I imagine, will be very interested to learn how their money has been used these past 2 years." It took the better part of that day and the days following to unravel the full extent of Silas Crane's scheme, and Cyrus Whitfield, once he understood that his fellow conspirator had been arrested and was already speaking freely to save his own skin, proved eager enough to confess his own part in exchange for leniency. The bank's board of directors, mortified to learn how thoroughly one of their own number had used the institution to defraud a rancher of his land, moved quickly to distance themselves from Crane's dealings, and within a week, Edgar Bristol found himself sitting across a desk from a new bank manager sent up from Prescott, a careful and courteous man named Harold Dunmore, who informed him that in light of the fraudulent circumstances surrounding the original note, the bank was prepared to extend the terms considerably, and moreover, to credit against the debt a sum representing the damages Crane's scheme had caused, damages the syndicate's remaining assets would be liquidated to cover. It was, in the end, enough to save the Bristol ranch outright, and more than enough besides, for the syndicate's holdings included several parcels of grazing land and water rights up and down Willow Creek that Crane had acquired through the same shady dealings, and which the bank, in settling the matter, offered to Edgar and to Pearl both at a price so fair it amounted almost to restitution for the years the feud between their fathers had cost each of their families. But all of that took weeks to untangle, weeks in which Pearl Hart and Edgar Bristol found themselves thrown together again and again, first over the practical matters of surveys and water shares, and the careful legal work of dividing Crane's forfeited holdings fairly between two ranches that had spent a generation fighting over far less. And then, as the practical matters gradually resolved themselves, simply because neither of them seemed to want to stop finding reasons to ride the 20 miles of road, or on a few memorable occasions the 6 miles of canyon trail between the Hart Ranch and the Bristol Ranch. It was on one of those canyon crossings, made this time in broad daylight with Edgar riding at her side rather than waiting anxiously at the other end, that Pearl finally allowed herself to say aloud what she had been feeling since the night of the flood. They had stopped at the spot where Dusty had lost his footing, the scar of the rockslide still visible in the canyon wall, pale against the red stone, and Pearl found herself staring at it with a strange detachment, remembering the terror of that fall as though it had happened to someone else entirely. "I think about that night more than I probably should," she admitted, as Edgar reined his horse in beside hers. "Not the flood, or Crane, or any of it. I think about the moment right here when I went down, and I thought for just a second that I might die in this canyon, and nobody would even know to look for me until morning." "I think about it too," Edgar said quietly. "More than I probably should, as you say. I think about what would have happened if you had turned back, if you had decided the risk was not worth taking for a man your family had no cause to love. I think about how close I came to losing everything, without ever once knowing that a woman I had spent years holding at arm's length was the only reason I still had a ranch to lose." "You were never at arm's length because I wanted you there," Pearl said, surprising herself with her own honesty. "I kept you at arm's length because it was easier than admitting I had thought about you a good deal more than a woman ought to think about her rival, Edgar Bristol, and because my father's ghost seemed to stand between us every time I let myself imagine otherwise." Edgar was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the dappled light that fell between the canyon walls. "And does he still stand between us?" he asked softly. "Your father's ghost?" Pearl thought of the letters she had found, of her father's torn apologies never sent, of the years of pride and stubbornness that had cost two families so much for so little real cause. "No," she said, "I do not believe he does. I believe if my father could see us now, riding this canyon together instead of letting it keep us apart, he would be glad of it, whatever bitterness he carried to his grave." "My father too, I think," Edgar said. "He was a proud man, and an angry one after the lawsuit, but I remember him laughing with your father before all of that, more than I remember anything else about those early years. I think some part of him always missed that friendship more than he ever let on." They sat their horses in silence for a while after that, the only sound the distant call of a hawk somewhere high above the canyon walls. And then Edgar reached across the space between them and took Pearl's hand in his, gently, as though asking a question he did not quite dare to voice aloud. "Pearl Hart," he said, "I do not know how a man properly courts a woman who has already saved his life and his ranch both, and who rides a canyon crossing better than most men I have hired in my life. But I find that I do not want to spend one more day pretending that what I feel for you is anything less than what it plainly is. I love you. I believe I have loved you for longer than I let myself admit, and I would count myself the luckiest man in this territory if you would consent to be my wife." Pearl felt her breath catch, felt tears rise unbidden and unashamed to her eyes, and found that for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not have to weigh her answer against pride or debt or the shadow of a feud that no longer had any claim on her heart. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Edgar Bristol, I will marry you, and gladly, and I do not care one bit that half of Larkspur Junction will say it is the strangest match this county has ever seen." He kissed her then, there in the heart of Redstone Canyon where she had so nearly lost her life to save his, the red stone walls rising up around them like witnesses to a peace that had been 30 years in the making. And when at last they broke apart, both of them were laughing with a joy too large to hold quietly. Word of the engagement spread through Larkspur Junction, faster than the flood itself had spread across the Bristol bottomland, and reactions ranged from delighted approval among those who remembered the old friendship between Nathaniel Hart and Thomas Bristol, to open astonishment among the younger folk who had grown up knowing only the feud and never the friendship that had come before it. Cyrus Whitfield, awaiting trial alongside Silas Crane in the territorial prison at Yuma, was reported to have laughed bitterly upon hearing the news, remarking that he supposed there was some justice in the fact that his own greed had ended up mending a rift he had hoped to profit from instead. The wedding was set for late June, time to fall after the spring branding was finished on both ranches and before the worst heat of summer settled over the valley, and it was held, at Pearl's insistence, at the very spot where Willow Creek ran between the two properties, on a stretch of grassy bank shaded by cottonwoods where, as legend now had it, Nathaniel Hart and Thomas Bristol had once shared a jug of whiskey to celebrate the completion of their first irrigation ditch together, back before either of them had a child old enough to remember it. The whole of Larkspur Junction turned out for the occasion, it seemed, ranch hands from both spreads standing shoulder to shoulder in their best clothes, the Hart cook and the Bristol cook working together over open fires to roast a whole steer for the wedding feast, children from neighboring ranches running wild through the cottonwood grove, while their parents visited and gossiped and marveled at how quickly old wounds could heal when two young people were brave enough to want them healed. Clara Bristol stood up as her brother's witness, radiant with happiness for him, and Jedediah Osler, gruff old foreman that he was, walked Pearl down the makeshift aisle of scattered wildflowers with tears standing openly in his eyes, for he had known her since she was in short skirts and had never imagined, in all his years on the Hart Ranch, that he would live to see this particular joy. The circuit preacher, a thin, earnest man named Reverend Cole who rode a wide loop through the territory ministering to ranches too far flung to support a church of their own, spoke the vows over the rushing music of the creek, and Pearl Hart became Pearl Bristol beneath a sky so blue and clear it seemed to have been ordered special for the occasion. And when Edgar kissed his bride, the whole assembled crowd of ranch hands and neighbors and friends let out a cheer that echoed clear up into the hills. They combined the two ranches under a single brand that summer, a design Edgar himself had sketched out one evening by lamplight, a simple joined H and B that the hands took to calling the Bridge Ranch, for it seemed to everyone who saw it that the mark itself was a kind of bridge between two families that had spent a generation apart. The old dispute over water rights, which had once seemed the immovable center of an unbridgeable feud, resolved itself with almost embarrassing simplicity once the two people who owned the competing claims were husband and wife rather than rivals, and the joint irrigation ditch that Nathaniel Hart and Thomas Bristol had dug together so many years before was widened and improved that very autumn, carrying water fairly to both halves of what was now, in every way that mattered, a single ranch. Pearl did not give up her independence in the marriage, and Edgar never once asked her to. She continued to ride out with the hands each morning, continued to keep her own ledger books alongside his, continued to be known throughout Yavapai County as a woman who could rope and brand and argue water law with the best of the men who had once doubted her ability to run so much as a henhouse alone. But she found in the years that followed that the loneliness she had carried since her father's death had been replaced by something she had not quite let herself hope for, a partnership built not on need but on genuine equal respect, a marriage in which she was never made to feel smaller for being capable, and never made to feel her capability meant she did not also long, in the quiet hours, for a hand to hold and a voice to share her worries with. Their first child, a son they named Nathaniel Thomas Bristol in honor of both grandfathers, was born the following spring, in the same ranch house where Edgar had grown up, with Clara Bristol and old Jedediah Osler both pacing anxious circles in the front room while the midwife from Larkspur Junction saw to the delivery. Edgar wept openly when he was finally allowed in to see his son, a great red-faced squalling bundle in Pearl's exhausted but radiant arms, and declared to anyone who would listen that the boy had his mother's stubborn chin and would no doubt grow up to argue with his father about everything under the sun, a prediction that proved, in time, entirely correct. A daughter followed 2 years after that, a dark-haired girl they named Clara Ann after her aunt, who had by then married a young rancher from the neighboring valley and moved just far enough away to visit often and never quite far enough to be truly missed. And after Clara Ann came a second son, born in the autumn of 1890, whom they named Jedediah in honor of the old foreman who had tried so hard to talk Pearl out of riding Redstone Canyon that fateful night, and who wept without shame when he learned of the honor, declaring that he had never in all his years expected to have a grandchild of the heart to spoil in his old age. The Bridge Ranch prospered in the years that followed, its combined herds growing fat on the well-watered grass of a valley no longer divided by petty grievance, its two houses eventually joined by a long covered breezeway that Edgar built himself the summer after Jedediah was born, so that Pearl's childhood home and his own might stand as one property in truth as well as in name. Redstone Canyon itself, that fearsome gash of red stone that had so nearly claimed Pearl's life, became in time something of a local landmark celebrated rather than feared, for the story of the night Pearl Hart rode it alone to save her rival's ranch was told and retold at barn dances and church socials throughout the county, growing a little in the telling each time, until children too young to remember the feud at all grew up knowing only the legend of the woman who crossed the canyon in the dark to save the man she would come to love. On quiet evenings, when the work of the day was done and the children were abed, Pearl and Edgar sometimes rode out together to the mouth of that canyon, dismounting to sit on a flat rock above the creek and watch the sun go down gold and red over the Bradshaw Hills, and Edgar would sometimes ask her, though he already knew the answer, whether she had ever once regretted the choice she made that night. Never, she told him, every time without fail. I rode into that canyon a rival, Edgar Bristol, and I rode out of it a woman who had found, without ever meaning to look for it, the truest love of her life. I would ride it 100 times over if it meant finding my way to you again at the end of it. And Edgar, who had once believed that the water dividing their two families ran too deep and too bitter ever to be bridged, would take her hand in his, calloused and strong from years of shared work on shared land, and think that no fortune the territory had to offer, no herd of cattle nor acre of grazing land nor share of Willow Creek's silver water, could ever compare to the fortune he had found in a woman brave enough to cross a canyon alone in the dark. For no better reason than that it was the right thing to do. They lived out their years together on the Bridge Ranch, watching their children grow and marry and have children of their own, watching the old feud between the Harts and the Bristols fade into nothing more than a story told to remind young lovers that even the deepest rifts could be crossed by those brave enough and good enough of heart to try. And if anyone in Larkspur Junction ever doubted the power of one woman's courage to change the whole shape of two families' futures, they needed only ride out to the Bridge Ranch and see for themselves the joined brand burned into every head of cattle, grazing peacefully across a valley that water and love had finally, fully, made whole.